Um, I guess I wanted to, I guess, start by saying, that I guess I'm really a buildings person, and I'm here partly because there's obviously overlap because I became very passionate about concrete, not least because I felt that we were struggling to get a lot of buildings listed because of the very negative image that concrete has as a material. And so that I'm here as a concrete fan, and really interested to see Barbara Hepworth working in the material. But I'm also here because, legally in the UK, sculptures are, if they're going to be preserved under the listed building legislation, they are basically labelled as mini buildings. And so that we end up campaigning for them. And one of the things that I've found particularly interesting over recent years is Tessa actually came on my concrete course at West Dean, and we've had since then a really interesting dialogue about the different attitudes and different assumptions about building conservation versus sculpture conservation, and particularly what happens when you have a sculpture in a very specific architectural setting, and you have to balance those two in one physical space when you might actually otherwise be doing things in two very different ways. So but this afternoon I've got two sort of sets of observations. One about what the kind of contemporary responses were in terms of the relationship of sculpture and buildings at the festival, and then just some few quick thoughts on what the associations were for concrete as a material at that sort of time. Anyway, so I'm going to show you a lot of images from this magazine, the Concrete Quarterly, which was one of the things that really conveyed an awful lot of both sort of inspirational and practical advice, specifically to architects and engineers about the use of concrete from the 40s right through. It's still basically produced, but its absolute heyday was from the 50s through the 60s, and the sort of fabulous photographs of brutalism that both promoted that form of architecture, and I think have been kind of that form of representation has been rediscovered through Instagram and photography more recently as part of the re-evaluation of brutalist buildings. I think a lot of the aesthetics of that one can trace back to some of the images here. So the Concrete Quarterly tells us that the South Bank, there are 4 concrete works, 2 by women and 2 by men, and that 2 were freestanding and 2 were relief. So that, real practical stuff. This obviously doesn't include the turning forms, the Hepworth, because these are the ones that were actually commissioned for the exhibition of sculpture, whereas turning forms was a sort of private deal that Jane Drew cooked up to get a second Hepworth in front of her building. So the 4 works were Standing Girl, that was in front of the 51 bar, Root-Bodied Fourth on the terrace of the station building, Sunbather's mural on the north wall of Waterloo Station building, and that's another one actually that Tessa and Andy have recently restored, and then the Figures of Industry building out on another one, wall-based one on the end of the Power and Production building. Fry and Drew were responsible for 3 buildings at the festival, and I think that the Riverside Restaurant is kind of the most almost sort of slightly frivolous and flamboyant of those buildings. And I haven't got a picture showing exactly where on the site it was, but we saw just now that the site is immediately adjacent to Waterloo Bridge. And I think it's relevant. I mean, we've heard already about how she wanted to to have the work of a woman sculptor in front of a building designed by a woman. At one point, she was trying to set up an all-female architecture office at around this time, and her location by Waterloo Bridge. I mean, the Waterloo Bridge had been rebuilt during the war. It had it was a Rennie bridge that had been failing and had been demolition had started before the war, and then it was being rebuilt to designs by Giles Gilbert Scott, who had done the Anglican Cathedral in Liverpool and done the telephone box, but because of the number of men who were away at war, certainly there's a whole kind of mythology around the rebuilding of Waterloo Bridge that it was the ladies' bridge because it was constructed by a largely female workforce. So I think that might be part of that broader context of the site. So, and then here are the two wall-mounted ones, the one on the right by Peter Perry and Carl Vogel's on the left. And here are these, the two freestanding works, Mitzi Cunliffe and Daphne Hardy's Standing Girl. So the freestanding women and attached men, I don't know. And this is what the Concrete Quarterly had to say about really the contrast between sculpture as it was shown in the Battersea Park site and the works that were shown on the South Bank, and that it makes that point that that it was two very different ways of looking at sculpture, and I like the fact that, I mean, there's the Festival of Britain is talked about in terms of a picturesque aesthetic and and here we're talking about how it says the sculpture here is scattered almost casually amongst the crowds and the picnic baskets, the publicised buildings and exhibits, and that points out that the works were at the South Bank were all specifically made for that site, for those specific sites in relation to those buildings. Peter Perry is recorded as specifically talking about his relationship between his work and the building it sits on. And he said the figures jutting out from the wall enrich the flat surface of the architecture, and the whole group can be seen and appreciated as one. The group in its relation to the neutral wall attracts the eye. The unusual angle is easily accepted as people have become accustomed to it through aerial photography, and perhaps another legacy of the war. So, there was quite a bit of criticism, I think, about some of the sculpture at the South Bank. And this is quoting from, I think it's from the Observer, the gaiety and confidence of the architecture was contrasted unfavourably with the solemn and self-conscious air of its more advanced sculptures. But the works in concrete were specifically singled out as being neither self-conscious nor solemn, but looking very much at home in their surroundings, and saying that their authors have had to work with other people, with the architects who commissioned them, and have had to contend with the a general functional problem, that of using essentially sculptural structural material, which I think again is interesting. So a kind of moving on to sort of reflecting about the image of concrete, I think it is important. This was the tonic to the nation, the celebration of the end of the war, looking forward. But I think there were all sorts of shifts going on in terms of how people were viewing concrete. I mean, the much rougher concrete of Le Corbusier's La Tourette and the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, where the kind of incidental marks of the formwork were being celebrated was something that was just beginning to be celebrated in the UK and certainly wasn't part of the aesthetic of interwar concrete. I think it is important that concrete was seen as absolutely crucial to winning the war. You know, the D-Day landings were achieved by floating more than 3 million tons of concrete landing structures across for D-Day. And the products that Tessa described, snowcrete, has been developed back in the 1920s, but the snowchem, that final coating, was a direct result of Blue Circle Cement's research for the government during the war to produce a really durable camouflage paint. But then also in 1950, Blue Circle Cement were really seriously concerned that the cement industry might be about to be nationalised. And the Labour Party had just put out a handbook on the cement industry, which says that it is a vital raw material, and that control by private monopoly should, is definitely not in the public interest. But is also kind of quite critical on saying that the cement industry has tended to be conservative minded in regard to research and development of new products, and perhaps suggesting that had the cement industry been privatized, nationalized at that point, then there might have been even more emphasis on technical research and innovation. And then I'm a huge admirer of Adrian Forty's work in his Concrete and Culture book, which I mean, in terms of, it's really difficult to try and grab a snapshot of where exactly we might have been in 1951. But I think that he makes the point that World War II has had a very specific impact on the meaning and associations of concrete, and that the idea of it being a material that was about progress has been overlaid with this thing that it's both about aggression, about conflict, and also about protection. And then moving on from that, that concrete has these kind of dualities that are still being worked through now, and certainly were very current then. So, is it an incredibly modern material, or is it basically just slightly souped up mud? Is it a natural material because it's full of aggregates, or is it really the result of a very sophisticated set of chemical processes? And is it something that's a sort of enormous technical virtuosity, or is it something that's actually deliberately kind of celebrating its both its poverty in terms of its low cost, but also in terms of its simplicity? And I think that all those dualities are perhaps interesting ways in which to take a new look at turning forms. So that's basically what I want to say. I did just want to say I would so much love to see it going round again, and we don't seem to be doing very well. As far as I can find out, the only other listed revolving sculpture is, and I may be wrong, but I'd love to know, Nam Garbo, which, interestingly, although obviously relating back to those works from the 20s that we were looking at earlier, this is a work that wasn't actually realised until 1975. It's listed at grade 2 star, and it sits in its own special pool outside the YRM building at St Thomas's Hospital. And I also wondered whether there was something here around, this is the Turning Forms was a work that was designed to sit outside the restaurant where you as a viewer are a static person, so that maybe that's why there is that increased desire to bring the movement to the work, because you're going to be static yourself, and that maybe that's also something in terms of commissioning a rotating work for a hospital where again the audience is not through any choice of their own, not exactly moving about very much. So thank you. I'll leave it there.